Hello, this is Pablo Sanchez from Barcelona. I pursued a master's degree in international relations and human security, and I am specialized in African studies. Today, I would like to talk about how European youth think and see Africa. But in fact, we should not talk just about European young people, but also about the most of European people, and probably not only about European people, but also about some other regions and continents people. The first mistake that some of the people they make is to consider that Africa is a unique country. Actually, it's plenty of them, and most of people they do not know even the half part of their names. And then we won't talk about capitals. Another mistake that it's not our fault, but our maps one, is that Africa's continent is much larger than it looks like at the maps that we normally use, and it's due to the scale that they use is wrong, and some regions and countries look smaller than they actually are. So Africa is much bigger than we think it is. Another problem, since the Africa is a really huge continent with a lot of different countries, we consider some of people they think that African people they look and they are the same. There are no difference among African regions, and it's really far from reality, because there are more difference between an Western African person and an Eastern African person than between, for example, an Italian and a Korean. So there are more difference between the people from one coast of Africa in comparison with the other coast than between European people and Asian people. And not only about biological or physical means, but also in terms of cultural, of religion, society, and other important topics. So African people, they are really different among them. We can find some Muslim countries, Catholic countries, and more other religions that they are not normally studied, because Africa is full, it's plenty of different ethnies that we think that they belong to a specific country. But the borders, another mistake that we normally make is to think that the borders of Africa they represent the different nationalities that the continent has, and that's not real, at least not in all cases, because most of the borders that we find in Africa are artificial, and they were made by colonizers, most of them from Europe. So some historical ethnies that they were living all together and they shared the same culture, gastronomy, religion, and society, they were divided, they were split into different countries. And some ethnies that they were never living all together because they were completely different in all means, they were put in the same country, in the same borders. So they shared the same government, and historically they were never living together. They were even not having any kind of relation among them. So borders in Africa, not only in terms of geography, but also in terms of society, of people, they are artificial. And that's a big problem that we find nowadays. That's the reason why some of the countries are currently in war, and we find some and lots of Lord of Wars and lots of war and problems with the different ethnies that are in Africa, because there are a lot of them, and as I was mentioning, they are pretty different among them. And we find lots and lots and lots of different languages in Africa. We think that they just speak French, Arabic, English, Portuguese, Spanish, but it's really wrong, because those are the languages that they were imposed by European colonizers and other regions. But actually, all African people, they normally have not only one but more local languages that they are related to their ethnies. And some of the ethnies, of course, they are living all together, they have a good relation, but we can find hundred or even thousands of different languages within the continent of Africa. So we have to be aware about the diversity of African people, African culture, African gastronomy, and that's an important thing that we have to take into account at the moment of not visiting Africa, but also studying Africa. And I think that the problem is not about the European people, but the content of the topics and fields that we study at school and later in high school, universities, college. So I think that we are not paying so much attention to African people, African history, African culture, probably in the States due to all the African slaves that they were bring to the American continent. They currently are paying more attention about the African history, but in Europe, I think that we should do the same, because we are strictly connected to Africa. We were colonizing back then most of the continent, so I think that we should study, we should learn from them. And some of the initiatives, some of the political and social movements that we have nowadays in Europe, they are thanks to African people. For example, I made my thesis about the Great Green Wall. It's an initiative from African people, not from African countries or, let's say, governments, but from the people, from the base, from small groups of people that they thought they decided to stop the desertification of the Sahel area, because they were losing their crops and they were facing lots of problems in terms of farming, in terms of agriculture. So they decided to plant natural local plants to make a natural border to stop the desert to reach the areas they had their crops. So they pretend, and actually they made it, to create a natural border, a plant border, let's see, a green border from one side of the continent to the other one. So from the west part to the east part, from the west coast of the Sahel to the east part of the Sahel, to stop desertification in major part of middle part African countries. So lots of other countries, governments and institutions, they thought that this initiative was so good. So in Asia and in Europe, they repeated the same way of acting. And that's just an example that we think that sometimes the African, they are in the back part, or we are leading all the social, cultural and political improvements, but most of the time they are doing so. So I think nowadays European people, because of the media means, TV channels, the new social networks, they are really focused on the United States media. the United States society, culture, and politics policies. But probably nowadays people, they are paying more attention into Asia because of the Korean culture, Korean pop, because of the Chinese economy that they are leading the global economics, because of the Japan culture, Japan anime, but they are forgetting about Africa. And all these regions, America, Europe, and Asia, they know that Africa is the future, because we are losing. We barely have no more natural resources on our countries, not only in Europe but also in America and Asia. And for example, Chinese people, Chinese businessmen and women, they are investing a lot in African countries because they know that they still have a lot of natural sources that they need for their companies to make their products. So Africa Africa will be the future, not only in material means but also in people means, because all the people that we find in Africa, all their wisdom, all their culture, gastronomy, political and society improvements, we have to learn about them.